Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Geeking Out podcast. I am the Athletic Geek, and this is a very special episode we have here. Um, this week we have, a friend of mine. We've watched several shows at my house, throughout all of the Metro East and the St. Louis area together, and we've even done a podcast talking about the history of St. Louis pro wrestling together. But this time we're gonna find out more about him and uh, done a lot of really cool stuff with wrestling in the St. Louis area. We have Patrick Brandmeyer here on the show. Patrick, thanks for doing this.
Sure, thanks for having me. It's been an interesting 20 years being around the St. Louis independent wrestling scene. There's plenty of stories to tell.
There are plenty of stories to tell, and we'll have time for hopefully quite a few fun ones. But the first question I ask everybody who's wrestling related that comes on the show is what got you interested in pro wrestling?
Well, I saw bits and pieces of it growing up. My cousin Jason was a big fan, and he kind of was the one who introduced me to it. So in general, as I often joke, yes, that was his fault. So, but But like I said, I saw bits and pieces growing up. I can recall seeing stuff like Hulk Hogan, King Kong Bundy from WrestleMania 2. I can recall seeing Macho Man and Zeus doing a promo, R.I.P. Zeus.
Yes,
And,
unfortunately.
and I didn't really get started watching consistently until the early 90s. There was something that was always had an kind of an odd appeal to it. It's one of those things that can be tough to describe, but it's one of those things where if you get it, you get it, and if you don't, then a lot of times you really don't. It's like I
Right.
said, it's hard to say.
Um. So you mentioned your cousin kind of got you started through this rabbit hole. Do you remember what was your first? Do you remember like going to any shows? Do you remember did you go to any of the WWF or WCW shows when they would come to the area before you kind of got into the independent scene, or was the St. Louis Indies kind of your first foray into seeing wrestling live?
Well, I went to WWF and house shows and other shows prior to going to independent shows. First live event I ever went to was March of 1993 at the old St. Louis Arena. Main event was Bret Hart and Mr. Perfect against Lex Luger and Razor Ramon.
Huh. I guess I'm going to assume that this is when Lex was still the narcissist.
That is correct. Also had Undertaker versus Yokozuna as the co-main event, so that was
Okay.
interesting battle of the super heavyweights before they fought each other on television.
That's pretty cool. Um, so growing up, would you consider yourself more of a WWF guy, or were you did you have a preference, or was WWF just the one that kind of came to town a little more often at the time, or how would you have described yourself as a wrestling fan back then?
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, WWF is what I got started on, and it would be another year or two before I started discovering that there was more out there than just them. It was about a year later that I found WCW on television and started watching that. And over time, I discovered the wrestling magazines at the store, the Mark Mag, so to speak, and learned about products like ECW, the original ECW, and smaller promotions and even stuff overseas. So, and of course, once I first discovered the internet in the mid 90s, that kind of really opened the rabbit hole to discovering more about things and kind of opening the quote unquote smart mark kind of mindset as far as the people I talked to who knew a little bit more about inner workings, who'd read the newsletters and stuff like that.
So I didn't really. I never got the internet myself until the year 2000.
Hmm.
Um, and by that time, I didn't even become quote unquote a smart mark until around 2002. You mentioned you finding all these, finding out about that kind of side of everything in the 90s on the internet. I had a gentleman got a YouTube channel named Bahu FMW, and he kind of described what his experience was like being in kind of that early internet slash tape trader scene. So, what was it like for you? What was your go to website? Was it a chat room? Like, take me through what the uh, the smart mark section of the audience was like on the internet when I was still just going, oh hey, cool, there's HBK,
Well, when I first when I first got online, it was the America Online forums for wrestling, the AOL Grandstand, and that was where the first place I discovered to discuss wrestling with people. And there was also the news groups, the Rec Sport Pro Wrestling, and there was the patronage differed between the people who had knowledge about what all was going on and the people who were just there to kind of troll others. So in that regard, some things have not changed quite that much.
No, absolutely not.
But over time, I kind of discovered a few different online writers, and there were different websites like Wrestling Scoops, the Smarks or whatever, and you kind of figured out as you went along which suited your particular taste. And I mean, I watched a little bit of everything back then as I did now, and of course, once the Monday Night Wars started in the mid '90s, I did tend to be more of a WWF guy than a WCW guy, and there were quite a few arguments online about Raw versus Nitro and stuff like that, and analyzing the ratings and figuring out what worked for when the two shows were going head to head, of course. So
Right.
that was a very interesting time in wrestling fandom.
Um, so you kind of, you mentioned that was your experience online. Did you ever participate in tape trading or anything of that nature to discover some of these more quote unquote obscure promotions, or did you just kind of have to cross your fingers and hope it got a TV deal? What was your experience with that?
I mean, most of the rarer stuff did have to be through tape trading. I did some tape trading, but not a lot of it. And I can remember one time a friend sending me VHS tapes of Japanese wrestling, and I got to see people like Misawa and Kawada and people like that. And it's a very different sort of product. It's not for everyone. It's in that particular era, it was very straightforward. The focus was in the ring and the strong style, as a lot of people would know it. And that was very interesting at the time. It wasn't something that I was able to get a hold of on a regular basis, but I mean, nowadays it's a little bit easier to watch such things. There are plenty of video sites online, and as well as
Absolutely.
streaming services like New Japan World. So
Right.
if it's something you're interested in, there are plenty of places to find it.
Absolutely. And but I always, I mentioned this in the Bahu um interview. I asked, everybody has kind of this romanticized um sort of nostalgia for the tape trading scene, but um as someone who wasn't part of that scene, it seems like a lot of work and a lot of inconvenience. Would you say that was the case, or were you just, as someone who participated to an extent, were you just happy to be seeing these new wrestlers from these different parts of the world?
Well, it kind of depended. I mean, like if you have the time to go through it, then cool. And at the time there was plenty on television, so there wasn't nearly as much of a motivation to go looking for other stuff. And I think it kind of depended on how much you preferred the different styles compared to what you could get for free on television without waiting however long for stuff to arrive in the mail. Like another friend of mine would send me Lucha Libre videos and videos of a little show that WWF put on a Latin American channel called Super Astros,
Okay.
and that was a very interesting viewing. He always told me about how it was a very unique product compared to regular WWF, and they even used people like El Hijo del Santo, Negro Casas, people who are nowadays would be considered legends in lucha libre, and a couple familiar faces like Taka Michinoku Funaki, uh, S.A. Rios. He was known as Papi Chulo back then, and some of the members of Los Boricuas from those days, like Miguel Perez. So it was an interesting program, and you got to see some talents that obviously you wouldn't see otherwise. Unfortunately, I think it was Univision at the time, so I wasn't able to watch it on my own cable network. So it was interesting to see that different product, and there was a part of me that wished they would do more with those guys, but it was kind of a niche product that they produced at the time.
Well, you mentioned as a niche product. Like, tell me a little bit more about just the Super. Was this in the Attitude Era, or was this in the New Generation era? When did the show
Yes,
take place?
yes, this was definitely late '90s, and I can remember going to a Raw in I think it was 1999 where they actually recorded some Super Astros matches before the live Raw,
Okay.
and I was able to see stuff like Papi Chulo, aka S.A. Rios, face Super Loco, who was super crazy working under a mask at the time. So there were some. It was some pretty cool matches. They had the Mexican minis in matches, so those are always very entertaining. And I mean the obviously the minis have a much more athletic style than you would expect from the American midget wrestling, which tends to be centered around comedy. So, like if you're used to just the American style midget wrestling, the Mexican minis would do this crazy athletic stuff, and it would, if you weren't used to it, it would kind of blow you away.
Absolutely. So, who were some of your favorite? You mentioned Komasawa, Kawada. Any more from the Japanese or Lucha Libre side that kind of became favorite wrestlers of yours through the tape trading scene at that time?
Well, I didn't do as much tape trading as I would have liked. Like I said, I saw bits and pieces. I liked Masawa a lot. Like I said, Kawada, Kabashi. I saw like pretty much the murderer's row of Japanese wrestling at the time. I I can recall seeing a little bit of Hayabusa, who was this revolutionary high flyer at the time, and someone who someone who unfortunately ended up being paralyzed
I
because
know it's
one of
such a
his high
tragic
risk
story.
maneuvers went horribly wrong and he landed on his head. But he
He,
was a guy who was an innovator of a lot of maneuvers. He was the inventor of the Falcon Arrow, which is used a lot today, and the Phoenix Splash, which Rich Swann and a few other people use. So he was one of those guys who was very much an innovator for his time. Also, his regular tag partner Jinsei Shinzaki, who
Hakushi.
American fans would know from his WWF run as Hakushi. And I can recall the feud he had with Bret the Hitman Hart in the mid '90s, and unfortunately his run didn't last very long. But he was one of those people who came to WWE and was doing stuff that people had never seen before. I can remember him facing Bret Hart on a Raw where he used the space flying tiger drop, and everyone was blown away to see that sort of thing on American television.
Absolutely. Um, so you kind of mentioned, your early days of the internet, how you found all these different sorts of wrestling out there. We talked a little bit in our previous uh, podcast about the St. Louis wrestling scene, how you came to get in, or at least watch the promotions in the St. Louis area. But for those that maybe missed that and are just picking up with this one, what's kind of the abridged version of how you found independent wrestling in St. Louis?
Well, it started, I started becoming aware of it on the AOL wrestling forums. I had conversations with a few people who worked for the promotion at the time in the late 90s called the Mississippi Valley Wrestling Alliance. Unfortunately, I never got to any of their shows, but it made me aware that there was independent wrestling in the area. Skip ahead to about 2000, and I was going to Broadcast Center at the time. And while I was there, I crossed paths with a guy who said that he was a local wrestler and that he worked for a local promotion and I should check out a show sometime. And that guy wrestled and currently wrestles as Ryan Ash, and the promotion was Gateway Championship Wrestling. And I went to my first show there in May of 2000, and and it was definitely a unique experience at the time. And as I said previously, I recommend going to an independent wrestling show at least once to just about any fan, just to see what you think of it, see how you like it. It's kind of a more up close, personal experience than a wrestling show. You usually get a chance to talk to the wrestlers and interact with them a
Mm-hmm.
little bit more than you would. And it took a few more months before I got to a show because they weren't running a whole lot in the immediate area. I mean, the first show I went to was in Florissant, Missouri, and I live in Belleville. And then I think the next show I went to was in Wright City, which is a bit of a haul away.
Right.
And and I can recall going to a few shows in DeSoto, Missouri back then, which again is a haul for someone who doesn't know the area and is only going on MapQuest directions printed out in the car. So,
MapQuest, aka Get Lost Quest.
oh yeah, and especially in the DeSoto area when they're in a whole lot of landmarks and you make a wrong turn, you could get lost for quite some time. Thankfully, I made it the first time I went down there. But I've got plenty of stories about just long drives off into the middle of nowhere to go to wrestling shows, and a few about comedy shows also. But back then, when there was just MapQuest and such, there you had to hope the directions were right, you had to hope the streets were right, and you had to hope the venue was visible enough that you could be like, okay, that's the place.
I want to say you bringing that up is reminds me of a time. It was 2008. Trying to map quest directions to an LWA show in House Springs, Missouri,
Uh-huh.
and just like
I can
says we're
recall
supposed to
that
go.
one being tricky to get to.
Yeah, I'm like, where is it? It's not there. And then like we think we found a KC hall, and it's like there's like a church. Like cause we're like, okay, the O'Fallon shows are at the KC hall, and we walk into a KC hall and our wrestling stuff, and there's like a legitimate church like sort of thing going on, and we're like, oh, hi, sorry, and just kind of doing the awkward back out slowly. And yeah, that was just kind of before we had we're fortunate enough to have GPS readily available. That was life as a wrestling fan. So ever since I've known you, you've kind of had a hand in at least helping with the shows in some way, be it helping the boys, ring announcing, everything. What was kind of your first foray into being more than just the guy who bought, be more than just a ticket buying fan? When did you start helping out more, and who kind of gave you, kind of stuck their hand out and goes, hey, this is a cool dude, let's have him help with the show?
Well, from the beginning, when I started going to independent shows, a lot of times when I got home, I would post results, do kind of a quick recap, and a lot of times, I mean, not every independent show has someone that will put up the results from the show. Like, I've even said in recent times that trying to find results from certain shows and certain promotions can be like pulling teeth at times, depending on who you're talking to. And every once in a while, I've had times where I'm like, "Do you have the results from the show?" And a couple of times, someone would kind of fire back, "Come to the shows and see for yourself." And I'm like, I can't always make it there, and sometimes it's on the other side of the state, so I can't always do that. Or sometimes back in the days when there were a ton more groups around, there would be 2 or 3 shows in a single night, then you obviously can't be everywhere at once. But back then, GCW was the only one I went to regularly, and they were the ones I knew, and a lot of people felt that they were head and shoulders above anyone else, and at the time, it was basically them, South Broadway, which was MMWA and SICW in one, and Rampage Championship Wrestling, which nowadays runs more in Central Illinois. So at the time, GCW seemed like the main one that was worth going to, and I followed them. I posted regularly about the shows. They had a little half-hour TV show on local access television at the time, and I did my best to follow that, even though they kind of shuffled the time slot around a little bit. Kind of similar to ECW on Fox Sports Midwest back in the day, where on a bad week you had to find it at like 3 a.m. on a Tuesday or something.
Right.
But over time, like, they got to know me at the shows, that I was a regular, that I liked the show, that I was a fan, and I think it was around the time of GCW's first anniversary show in 2001 that I started bringing my camera and taking pictures, and I started doing that regularly, and they contacted me and asked if they could use some of my photos on their videotape covers, and that was a little bit of the start of it. They also asked, and eventually they asked me to write official columns and recaps for the GCW website, since I was going to quite a few shows at the time. So over time, my role kind of expanded. It would be a few more years before I did the video commentary, since they had their own TV commentators at the time. So, but over time, I kind of got to be a regular part of the group, I guess you could say.
Awesome. Awesome. So you mentioned you kind of got to be part of the group, that way. Do you remember, since you kind of got to be part of the group, I'm sure you got to see and do things with some of the boys that a lot of other fans didn't. You don't have to mention any names to protect the innocent, but do you have any, like, holy shit, this is kind of stories, from being around the boys on a night after the show or during the show or anything of that nature where you're like, oh fuck, well, this is big time right here, you know what I mean?
I mean, I was I was present at a few post-show meetings where the promoter speech was had kind of a stricter tone, I will say,
Okay.
and that was kind of interesting to be there for. And I mean, like, there are a lot of things that the average fan wouldn't be aware of, like, especially when it comes to the Missouri Athletic Commission and stuff like that, because they have a lot of over the years they've had a lot of restrictions based on what you can and can't do on a show, and and if those things do happen, then sometimes people get fined, and in independent wrestling, that's generally not something that a promotion can afford all that easily. So it's something where the wrestlers need to know what's going on. The referees and the people in the back need to know what's going on, and it's something where the fan wouldn't think too much of it, but in the back it could be something pretty a little more serious. It's kind of hard to describe, but it's unless you've been there, it's one of those things where you wouldn't give it a second thought. But as someone who has been at some of those pre or post show meetings, and or someone who has just talked to the people in the know over the years, you kind of get more of a feel of like of just kind of a, oh crap, that I don't know about that one, that sort of thing.
Right.
Whether it's sometimes it's something like someone forgetting themselves and using a little more colorful language than they should have during a promo.
Right.
Like especially when there's a lot of kids in the audience. I've seen that happen once or twice, and but when I was doing commentary, and I could literally see people kind of cringing or face palming backstage at the time. Because, I mean, sometimes you just kind of forget yourself, and it just comes out over a live mic in front of a bunch of kids. So I don't know.
So you mentioned color commentary, and full disclosure, me and Patrick have done commentary together for MMWA a few times in 2018, 2019, but we're not going to go too deep into my failed foray as a commentator. But uh, you've done quite a bit of commentary over the over the years. What all promotions have you contributed to with color commentary?
I mean, GCW was the first. I've called the action for several different promotions at least once. Like I did commentary for Broadway, as noted. For a little while, myself and Drew Abbenhouse called the action on the SICW television show. I've trying to think of a few others. I did kind of an online stream of commentary for a promotion called Outlaw Wrestling out in the middle of Illinois. That was, I believe, the Hooligans Devin and Mason Cutters promotion. And there were a few others. Unfortunately, I'm kind of drawing a blank on a few of them, but at different times I've been fortunate to call the action for quite a few different promotions. Glory Pro was one that was only a one-time deal at the time, but it was a very cool moment because it was their first anniversary show, and I got to call Naito's match with AR Fox, and that was a very cool thing, very unique experience at the time.
Well, I was going to ask you about that later. We'll just go ahead and bring that up now. You got to call a Tetsuya Naito match. What was it like? We did our commentary for Broadway, and it's a great production over there. The venues special, fans are great. The production values were top notch at the time when we were doing it. Um, but a lot of the talent were kind of just independent talent. Either older guys, like Gary Jackson, who just still enjoy wrestling and want to wrestle in the area on the weekends, and then some up and coming guys that have yet to really establish their name. Uh,
And I will always tell the story that that first live wrestling event I went to in March of '93, WWF, Gary Jackson wrestled on that show.
that is even cooler.
Yep, they needed someone to fill in, and he was there and had his gear with him, so he had a match with Typhoon at the time, and
Nice.
it pretty much ended the way you would think. But that's one of those odd little throwbacks to where, like, I saw him at that show, and years later I got to talk to him about that. So that
That
was
is
pretty
really
cool.
cool. Um, but here you go into Glory Pro, which has right now distribution on two worldwide streaming platforms with the High Spots Video Network and Independent Wrestling.tv, calling a match of a guy who main evented the Tokyo Dome just a month prior. Um, what was it
Mm-hmm.
like to kind of get to call a match with a person of that magnitude?
I mean, as far as calling wrestling matches go, I mean, you'd have to call that like a high point of ever doing it. And I mean, it was, you have to look at it as like a huge crowd at the venue. There's like just so many people there at the time. It's such a cool thing. And I can recall just taking a picture at the from the table when I was calling the action live of just over the whole crowd, and getting another picture when Naito was making his entrance, just the whole crowd on their feet. It was just an amazing experience, and it's hard to describe. It was, I mean, it was a one-time thing, and I kind of got called in at the last minute at the time, but just to get that opportunity was such a cool thing. I got a chance to meet Naito, get a picture with him afterwards, and
And Naito's such a cool dude when you meet him. Um,
absolutely. And I
you,
was, like I said, I was very fortunate to be in that position, and I'm happy I got a chance to do it.
well, it's kind of funny you mentioned that. You mentioned we're talking about Gary Jackson, being a last minute replacement, and then and then you get to be a last minute replacement and you get to call a Naito match. So it's kind of like you're like the announcer version of Gary Jackson.
Yep, something like that. I mean, I know my stuff. I know I your mileage may vary as to my announcer voice. I know I I wish I sounded like the cool radio guy. Instead, I sound like I need a Kleenex half the time, but that's okay.
No, there were 'cause, when we were doing the commentary over at Broadway, there'd be times I'm sitting there, and God bless Dirty for having faith in me. Like, no, you got this. You can do this by yourself. No, I can't. No, I can't do that, Dirty. Please don't make me do this by myself. Because there's like a few
Yeah,
times
I've
like you were running late, and I'm like, Patrick, please get here. Patrick, I need you. Patrick. And then you walk in, I'm like, oh, thank God, there he is. There's Patrick. We can do this now.
I have I've called shows solo, and I will say that it is a challenge because, like, especially at times when there isn't much to talk about and you feel like you want to say something in there, but so it's definitely better to have two people doing commentary.
Yeah.
I mean, any more than that can be tough because you got a lot of people trying to get their thoughts in. Just so to me personally, two is ideal. There was a time period in WWE when there were three commentators on every show, and it got a little rough at times. I'll leave it at that.
Right. I think we're going off on tangents, but this is we're about sharing stories on this here podcast. I remember it was when they had the Texas Death Match,
Uh-huh.
and they had Moondog Rover, and help me out with who the other guy was.
Uh, Big Texan.
Big Texan, that's it. I was thinking Texas, but I couldn't think of the whole name. I apologize if he ever listens to this. Sorry about that.
Uh-huh.
And they
And it
had
was Texas Death Match in a cage.
Texas Death Match in a cage, and they had like this. After every pinfall, they had 10 seconds to get up and 30 seconds to rest. And the guys were working hard. I'm not going to take anything away from the work that both men did that night. But I remember um, this was the main event. I was getting hungry. You were getting hungry. We had originally had plans to go partake in, as the Young Bucks call it, fine Japanese cuisine at the TGI Fridays. And I was hungry. I was ready to go. I was ready for this match to get over, and I feel so bad, like, because that match, you hear me, like, probably can hear me while I'm kicking out, like, oh God, he can't believe it, he kicked out.
I've been to long shows. I've been to shows that went late, and as I get older, I become much more fond of shorter shows, shows that start earlier in the evening. And like I said, I have been to some marathons. I've been to shows that were 4+ hours. So, and I'm at the point where I have a little bit more trouble standing up through whole shows, and if the people in front of you are standing, you kind of need to stand up too just to see what's going on. So
Absolutely.
I'm definitely appreciating shorter shows more these days. Like, I realize that it's an indie thing and it's a WWE thing to try to get as many people on the show as possible, which is how we get multi-way schmaz matches all over the place. But that's another whole can of worms we could open at another time.
Absolutely.
So,
That's you mentioned marathon shows, and I'm like, Bud, you gotta do WrestleMania once and get through that marathon.
yeah, the early WrestleManias had like what, 12 to 14 matches at times. So, even if they weren't very long, that's still a lot to get through. And even more modern WrestleManias, there's just there's so much. There's the length, there's the video packages, there's the performances, the fireworks, and all that in between the matches. And by the time you're done, it's practically midnight.
Oh,
So,
it was midnight by the time we got out of MetLife Stadium, not the MetLife Center, as Hulk Hogan put it. And then we had to wait even longer due to the train system. Just that they're only running like literally one train back and forth.
uh,
So like there were
I mean,
people waiting.
for most of the time, I've been going to shows at what is now the Enterprise Center. I've usually taken the Metrolink because I'm fortunate that there's a station near me that I can
Right.
take to there, and instead of trying to find a place where I can park and have it not cost an arm and a leg. So I definitely prefer to take the train to when I go to shows there.
Um,
As for as far as WrestleMania goes, I can only imagine the mob of people leaving after the show's over, and you definitely have my sympathy in that regard.
we got lucky and we had an out, but we didn't have to wait as long as some people did. But some people had to wait till 4 or 5 in the morning to get out, and
Oh
oh
wow.
boy. So you mentioned your time as a commentator. What were some of the more interesting things that you were asked to do with some of these local promotions?
Well, I did have the one time where, like, you mentioned ring announcing. Unfortunately, that was only a one-time thing.
Oh,
So,
okay.
but and it was from people who knew me. The it was a smaller promotion called High Risk Wrestling. They'd run a few times locally, but they struggled to draw in this area, so they eventually moved all the way out to Warsaw, Missouri, around Lake of the Ozarks. And at one of their last shows several years ago, they asked me to ring announce, and they even said wear the Wayne's World hat, which I
Nice.
did. And I rode down there in a carpool. It was with Brandon Aarons, Danny Adams, and Paco. So that was quite the carload on the way down there. Like I I'm not good at tying neckties, but I wore the nice slacks and suit jacket and just tried to dress well about as well as possible. And I had no problem with the ring announcing. I think my biggest concern was not tripping over the ropes, which is, and if you've ever tried to step through ring ropes, it's a little trickier than it looks from the outside. So,
Absolutely.
and it was a fairly short show, only about I think 5 matches, but I had a good time doing it. I'm glad I was able to check that off my bucket list. I realized that locally I'm pretty far down the totem pole as far as ring announcers go compared to Ben Simon, Chris Rodell, Luke Roberts, and the various other people who ring announce in the area. But I always kind of put it out there that I can ring announce if needed. So I'll just, and that's kind of the best way to put it.
Absolutely. Um, so, in addition to wrestling, one thing you do quite a bit in the area is you do stand up comedy. What inspired you to pursue comedy and, kind of tell us about your comedic style and some stories from your comedy gigs?
Well, I'd always been a big comedy fan. Growing up, my favorite was Bill Cosby. That's not quite as cool to say nowadays, but it was true at the time. And I can remember even telling some of his routines to kids at school. And there were even times when I actually kind of told some of his routines in front of the class. And that was kind of my first taste of it as a child, but over time I wasn't quite as wasn't quite as social, but it was something that was always in the back of my mind that I wanted to try to do. And I mean, over the years, I was really big into Saturday Night Live, which was where the Wayne's World hat thing came from.
Right.
And a big part of it, though, was through my wrestling connection. I knew a local wrestler named Dan Walsh who also did comedy, who did the open mics at the Funny Bone. He's moved out to California since then and is no longer wrestling. But he was someone I knew who did it. I remember asking him a few times about it and signing up, and he gave me a few pointers to start out. I went to a few open mics to start out to kind of see how things went. And the funny thing is, I remember one of the first shows I went to, one of the guys who was new and up there for the first time. I can recall him going up there, and it was very clear that he was going up there expecting to tear the house down in his 4 minutes of fame, and he didn't. It was very clearly stuff that I don't know if his drunk buddies told him he was hilarious or what, but it didn't go over well. And and the funny part about that is me thinking to myself, I can do better than that. As strange as that sounds, but I did. I wrote a few things, and I kind of learned how the open mic structure goes, and trust me, that can be a very long or a very short 4 minutes depending on how you do.
Right.
Like if you got a minute and a half to go and you got nothing left, that can be tricky to deal with. Like, but back then there was an online sign up at the Funny Bone. I did the online sign up, and the thing is, at the time, if it was you were a first timer and they didn't know your name, they'd usually put you up. So first time I ever signed up, I was on the list.
What are your memories
And
from your first open mic night?
uh, very nervous, obviously. I mean, I still get a little nervous before I go on stage, but back then it was one of those things where it was like, well, we'll see how this goes, and if it doesn't go well, then I'll just leave it at this. And I talked to a couple of the local comics at previous shows, so a couple of them at least knew who I was. And I went up pretty early, which is good because I might have psyched myself out if I had to wait any longer than that. And I went up. I had a couple of decent lines. I don't know how much I would use today. Of course, that was almost 15 years ago at this point. But I got a couple good laughs, I and quite a few of the local people said I did all right for a first time, and that was pretty cool. Like, as a matter of fact, Nikki Glazer was at that show. Like, she was fairly new to comedy at the time. She'd done a couple of bigger shows, but she was obviously based out of St. Louis and did the open mics when she was around. she did a set on that show, and after the show, when all the other comics were hanging out, Nikki made a point to come up to me and said, "You did really well for your first time," and that was very cool of her.
That's
At
awesome.
at a time when I absolutely would not have been able to approach her and introduce myself and start a conversation with her. So that was a very cool thing for of her, and I would continue to try to write. I would continue to sign up, and I would get on every once in a while. I was obviously very new, and the second time did not go nearly as well as the first time, as it usually doesn't. In fact, I can recall the after my second time, I can recall the open mic host going up to the stage and wisecracking, "I guess I should tell a joke since that guy didn't."
Ooh. Well, I was getting ready to ask. I said I'm not trying to trudge up any bad memories, but do you think you could? Do you have a story from like what you thought would be like your best? There's my home run, set that you've had, and then kind of had, do you have like if you feel comfortable sharing your one where you're like, oh dear, just get me the fuck off the stage right now, kind of stories.
Oh, I got a pretty good story about that. It was
I want to
when
hear
there
a good
was a
one and a bad one. I don't want to just go bad here.
oh no, it's all right. I was doing a showcase show at Comedy Etc. in Fairview Heights, and it was a showcase show, and I was hosting, and I'd done my set at the top of the show, went great. Everyone else was doing great. I got the introductions fine, and I'm getting ready to introduce the last guy on the show. At that point, it would have been thunderstorming outside, and the power blinked. And I'm and when the lights cut, it wasn't out for long, but and the power came back on. But the problem was the headliner had wanted to record his set, and he needed time for his equipment to reboot and everything. And at that point, I'm like, well, should I bring up the headliner? And the club manager literally said over the mic, "Patrick, stall." And I had nothing. I'd done everything I'd planned to do at the start of the show, and I was just friggin' deer in the headlights on stage, had no idea what to say. It got to the point where some of the other comics came up on stage and we kind of riffed together to kill time because, like I said, I was at a loss. And like some of the other local comics will tell that story to this day. And and I can laugh about it now. At the time, it wasn't quite as funny, but it's one of those things where you learn to have at least something in your back pocket just in case.
um, okay, so that was kind of not that's your bad story. Tell me your good story. Tell me like where you called your shot and you pointed to the fence and you hit it right there. You have any stories like that?
I don't know if I have any particular home runs. I mean, just times when, like, one of the established comedians or, like, the professional comedians, like, talk to me and say, like, "You've come a long way, you've improved a lot, you've gotten really good." Whether it is someone like Nikki Glazer or somebody who's been on radio and television like Greg Warren or Tommy Johnigan, dropping plenty of names here. And and just some of the cool experiences were just meeting people as they come through town. Like one time, thanks to the wrestling connection. In fact, it was almost a year ago that I got to open for Hacksaw Jim Duggan at the Funny Bone,
Oh, really?
and that was a very cool experience. He was a super nice guy. I joked at the time that I am comfortable in my spot of getting all the wrestling related gigs now that Randy Orton's younger brother has moved to New York. So
Well, I think a
so
lot of people may not know this, but Randy Orton's younger brother is a comedian, and you have
absolutely,
done some
very good one.
done some gigs with him. I've heard that Randy Orton's younger brother is not a wrestling fan in the slightest, but I can
Yeah,
neither
he'll
confirm nor deny that.
I mean, he's done a few wrestling related gigs. He ring announced one time a couple of years ago. And as a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, he was on the most recent Talking Shop of Mania.
Okay. I haven't seen that
Like
yet. I'm going to have to revoke
when
my
they
High
had
Spots
the
fan card there, but
yeah, when they did like this faux evolution thing, and they had Nathan in there in Randy's spot. So that was pretty funny to hear about. That
that's
like
pretty
he's
good.
like you can see the family resemblance if you're looking for it. He's kind of tall and skinny. He's in good physical shape, but unfortunately he had some medical issues that prevented him from pursuing the family business. So he never really got into that, and I can only imagine how often in his life he's been asked about his brother, about his dad.
Yeah,
And he has a couple wrestling related jokes, but for the most part, he kind of stays away from that sort of thing. So, I mean, like he's moved to New York, he's doing well for himself, and good for him, you know?
absolutely. So, last thing I really wanted to ask you, um, and we can. Patrick's coming back. We got a lot of big projects planned together, so we'll.
Like I said, there's a lot of stories to tell.
There's a lot of stories to tell. We'll be tangenting off of a lot of other stories, whether it be just talking about the history of St. Louis wrestling again or watching wrestling together. We will. Patrick's coming back, but the one thing I really wanted to kind of end this interview with is, you know, you're a wrestling fan. You're someone who helps with wrestling, and you're a stand-up comedian. What are kind of your three of your goals as a fan, a comic, and a participant in the wrestling business do you want to do still?
Well, as far as comedy goes, I'd like to get a chance to do a longer set at a club. I've done longer sets at bar shows out in the middle of nowhere. I've been able to do. I mean, open mic is 4 to 5 minutes. A showcase is maybe in the 10 to 12 range, or a hosting spot. The middle act, the feature act, as they call it, that's about 20 to 25 minutes, and that's a spot I want to hopefully get down the line once clubs are doing full shows again. Because I've done 20 to 25 at bar shows, bar showcases where I got more time, and that's an opportunity I hope to get down the line. That's kind of my next immediate goal as a comedian. It also helps you make a little bit more money on that. That's kind of a nice perk. And
Absolutely.
anytime you get paid to do it is pretty cool. But
Well, that
as
that
far as
what that one more question, I guess. Have you been paid yet as a comic, or is this just open mic, just volunteer? How does that work?
I've had several paid comedy gigs over the years, whether it was hosting on the weekends, whether it's doing a showcase, or doing a or do just doing like a bar show out in the middle of Illinois or Missouri,
Okay,
and it's a nice it's always nice to be able to do that, to be able to do something you enjoy and get paid for it. And
absolutely.
I mean, it's not easy to work your way up to that point. And I say that, like, I've done comedy for like 14 and a half years. I probably sucked for about the first five of that. And it took a lot of time to get to where I was doing consistently well. And I mean, some people are just naturals right out of the gate. For other people, it takes time to build up that confidence. And that's what it took. That I had to do it for quite a long time before I finally got to the point where I can have the confidence to say that if I'm going to be going on stage to do comedy, that I'm going to do a good job. And I even joke that I'm generally not a self-confident person, but that's one thing I can say I'm confident about in myself. As far as wrestling goes, I mean, I'm happy just doing commentary if asked to do it. If anyone ever wants me to do ring announcing, I'm more than happy to do that. I mean, I've had my time kind of partially in the wrestling business, kind of on the fringes of the wrestling business. I mean, it was a good time, but I'm kind of at the point where I'd kind of kind of prefer to hang back and be more of a fan because sometimes on the inside it does get a little heavy. Uh, I think that's the best way to put that. I mean, there's always going to be drama on some level, and sometimes you hear about it on the internet, sometimes you don't. So sometimes it's better to just keep your distance from that sort of thing before people start deciding that you need to pick a side or that you're betraying them on some level or however you want to look at it. So
That's
I'd
very
kind of
true.
rather just sit back in the stands and be a fan these days, you know?
Absolutely. And as a fan, what are some things you'd like? I mean, I know at the time of this recording, we're still in the midst of a global pandemic, and not a lot of time or shows that are readily available for us to go to. But like, what are some of the things you'd like to participate in as a wrestling fan? Like, what are your fan bucket list goals?
Uh, I think one of the main bucket list things I want to do is to take in a Shimmer weekend up in Berwyn around Chicago. That's something I've always wanted to do. Uh, One of the few shows I went to this year was in Mount Vernon, Illinois, and it was an all women's show. And that's something not a lot of promotions will attempt. I think St. Louis Anarchy did one about a year and a half ago, and
And even
of
then, like
course,
they had a no show. So Gary, who was kind enough to do the podcast once, actually got to wrestle Kylie Ray on that show. I do remember that much.
I remember that being a really good match. And I know Kylie's unfortunately had to step away from the wrestling business, and as someone who can sympathize when it comes to mental illness, that's a tough thing to go through, and
Absolutely.
sometimes that is absolutely something you need to do, and sometimes it can be a very difficult thing to do. But you got to do it for your own sake. And it's one of those things where you may internally feel like you're being selfish or you feel like you're letting people down, but on the same token, it's if you don't do that, it can be a self-destructive path. And so, like I said, she's doing what's
She's
best for
doing what
her right now.
absolutely she is. Even though I'm gonna miss seeing Smiley Kylie, I hope she's doing
Abs-
well. Um,
Absolutely.
so you want to take in a Shimmer weekend? Anything else? I mean,
I mean, as far as like big wrestling shows in the area, I kind of regret not going to the Royal Rumble was when it was in St. Louis a few
oh, you
years
missed
ago.
that? That sucks, dude. I'm so sorry.
I mean, as far as live experiences go, I was fortunate to be at Bad Blood with the first Hell in a Cell. I was fortunate to be at Survivor Series in 1998 when The Rock won the title for the first time. I mean, I can recall one of going to a house show in June of 1993 and actually seeing a house show title change when the Steiners beat Money Incorporated. That was
Oh
pretty
wow, that
cool.
is cool.
Uh-huh. And and I've had a lot of cool experiences. I mean, you've been fortunate enough to be at a WrestleMania. That's something that might be a little out of reach for me realistically, but if it ever happens, it would be a very cool thing. And maybe, like, if all restrictions put by the wayside, it'd be cool to go to a WrestleMania. It'd be cool to just go to a wrestling show in Japan, any wrestling show, just for that
Absolutely.
experience.
Yes. And
So,
I feel like it's just talking right now. I feel like if WrestleMania can ever come to the Midwest, it's too much of a pipe dream to think WrestleMania in St. Louis, but if WrestleMania ever goes to Chicago or Indianapolis or Nashville,
mhm,
Tennessee, or something like that, to where we don't have to get on a plane, I feel like then
yeah,
we could probably get to a WrestleMania. Then get you to a
yeah,
WrestleMania for that.
yep. First WrestleMania I watched live was WrestleMania 8 at the Indianapolis Hoosier Dome. And from what I understand, the attendance wasn't what they would have liked it to be, and that's why they never brought it back to the Midwest, other than Chicago. So, but that was a very memorable WrestleMania to be my first one seeing it live. Like two of my favorite matches of all time: Bret Hart, Roddy Piper, and Macho Man Randy Savage and Ric Flair, plus the surprise return of the Ultimate Warrior at the end. So very
Absolutely.
memorable show.
And Papa Shango missing his cue. That also happened.
Absolutely.
Well, Patrick, I appreciate you, doing the interview. Looking forward to the other projects we have in the works. But for some of the folks out there, if you do you have any social media for people to follow, keep up with what you're doing?
Generally, my social media is under Patrick AB7. That's me on Facebook and Twitter. Patrick.ab7 for Instagram. You can also search my name on YouTube and see a couple of my comedy sets on there. Just recent stuff from the Funny Bone in general.
Awesome. Well, definitely provide some links to those in the description box below. And thanks for doing the interview, and thanks for being part of the channel, man.
All right, thanks for having me.
No
See you
problem.
around.
And be sure to check out Patrick on his social media, but also check me out on my social media, facebook.com/athleticgeek89, Twitter athletic_geek89, and Instagram at athleticgeek89. If you enjoyed this, please give a like, share, subscribe for more content from all different corners of geek culture. Comic books, pro wrestling, gaming, anime, you name it, we try to have it on the channel, or as best as we can during this pandemic. And if you'd like to help this channel out financially, hit me up on Patreon. That's patreon.com/athleticgeek89. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.